It's time for another episode of 2-on-1, the internet's fastest growing dance sensation, with your co-host, the Reverend Arthur Stewart.
And I'm the Reverend Stephanie Kendall. I never know where you're going to go with these, and I look forward to them every week.
Yeah, it's like the twist, the mashed potatoes, and the 2-on-1. So, hey, by the way,
Hi.
Honestly, we should probably break into the dance genre because we're already a podcast and a video, like a recorded live talk show. But do you have any other mediums or media that we should break into at this point?
I mean, we're on TikTok, although we keep getting banned.
Oh,
we keep getting suspended. But that's another issue. We'll talk about it later. It's wild, y'all. So wild west out there. Guess who sent me a new chalice?
Who sent you a chalice?
Our good friend Jessa Decker Smith saw it when I broke the chalice for the David Byrne episode, and so she sent me a new one. Which
that's nice of her. And speaking of the David Byrne episode, I got my copy of the Book of Tiny Prayer.
Yay!
They were 2 for the price of 3 on the big international conglomerate I always urge people not to buy from. Speaking of books, maybe that's a medium 2-on-1 could break into. Do you think?
You know what? I believe last week I heard something about that with Brad Lyons.
Yeah, I think so too. So we have a book coming out in early 2022, huh?
We do. Jesus out there, get ready. We are creating, cultivating, and editing a book of pop culture and theological conversations, kind of musings, if you will, from some collaborators that have been on the show, that are going to be on the show. That range through very varied topics and things, but it's going to be a congregational resource, but also something that like everyone can benefit from. So
absolutely. And it's just 2-on-1 casts a wide and a deep net, and we would not let our listeners and viewers and deuces down by not doing that for this book. So it's going to be a variety of folk with a variety of views, and like we have everything from the Abbott brothers to Ted Lasso to Schitt's Creek to Beyonce. So it's going to be.
And Loki, we've got Marvel.
We've got some Marvel.
We run the gauntlet. It's pretty. It was the contributors and people that it's in partnership with Bethany Fellows, which we are both a part of or have ties to, and being obviously published by Chalice Press, and so lots of good connections in there. And I don't know, the contributors list was awesome. It was fun to put together and kind of say, this is the vision we're casting. This is what we want our name tied to. That was a big conversation, who and what and how and all of the things. And because this book is something that will come with us forever. So
well, we can't talk about names being tied to us without bringing up the first name and the last name in all of your liturgical textile needs. The first name is Jeff and the last name is Wunrow. And of course, we want to talk about our lead sponsor on 2-on-1, Jeff Wunrow Designs. Jeff Wunrow Designs for 16 years has been making ordinary time extraordinary through the purveyance, creation, sewing, and putting together of paraments, banners, frontals, chasubles, copes, pastoral stoles, diaconal stoles, and now even face masks are part of their wide and varied catalog.
I mean, and as we talked about cultivating, the look and the feel of the book, Jeff works with you to create any stole that, sits on your heart. If you have a favorite biblical character or passage that you want represented on a stole, Jeff can make it happen. One of my favorite things to do is follow like all of his specialty stoles that he has made, like his custom made stoles for people, and dream about what one I would love to have, which we all probably know is, Revelation's Jezebel, but that's a whole other issue.
Revelation Jezebel. Her name is Revelation Jezebel. I'm going to write a parody.
Hamilton parody.
Called Revelation. It's going to be amazing. That's my 2023 project once we get this book done. Jeff Wunrow Designs, however, makes things work for you. Go to jeffwunrow.com, JEFFWUNROW, to check out their entire catalog of stoles that are readily available. Additionally, make sure that you look at customization options. Spiff can tell you all about that anytime you want to know. And do note that through the end of this year, the current era 2021 You can use the code 2on1, all one word, all letters at checkout. Make sure you pay attention to where to put in the discount code if you use Apple Pay. 2on1, and you will receive 15% off all of the stoles you order and pay for. So that's one stole is 15% off. That's 10 stoles are 15% off. It's the best offer out there. This coupon ends at the end of 2021. We're only going to talk about it.
Only coupon out there right now. So for those of you who still need to get your Christmas presents, it is the only and best coupon out there for Jeff Wendell right now.
We're only going to talk about this 5 more times in 2021 because we only have 5 more episodes after today. And we're going to remind you one last time, not one last time, but in this moment, jeffwunrow.com, jeffwunrow.com. 16 years of making ordinary time extraordinary.
And we're almost done with ordinary time for the year.
No, since it's always Advent or almost Advent, it's almost Advent. And by the way, happy 75th show today, Spiff. This is number 75.
Happy 75th show, Arthur. Yeah, we've come a long way.
I know. We have a long way to go, baby.
3 is coming up. That's wild.
Yeah.
And speaking of multiple seasons, I'm really excited for today's conversation. People have been talking about it online. I've been hearing about the show for years from our guest, Reverend Barbara Dunlap, who now runs Sacred Worth Ministries, which is really exciting. I can't wait to hear all about that. But we're talking Call the Midwife. Hello.
Barbara Dunlap, welcome to 2on1.
Hi, thanks for having me.
We're so excited to have you. So for those of our deuces out there that don't know Reverend Barbara Dunlap, Barbara, would you like to tell the deuces, the folks out there, who you are and what you do?
Hi, well, I am an ordained United Methodist deacon, which is a whole weird thing between elders and deacons, but basically my deacons are called to word, service, compassion, and justice. And so that is really where my heart lies. And I, as of October 1st, have started my own ministry. I left the local church where I was an associate minister, and I am now the founder of Sacred Worth Ministries. And I'm excited about where that's going to go, working to help answer the question, what would the world look like if women and girls were seen as children of God with sacred worth? So I'm excited. And, that all ties in with, of course, what we're talking about today. So big surprise.
Absolutely. We're super excited. So Arthur, do you want to do a little recap of what Call the Midwife is, as you do?
Call the Midwife is a British Broadcasting Corporation television show with multiple, like a dozen, I think, series at this point.
We're in year 10.
Year 10.
Yeah.
Following a South London district of the Anglican Church at St. Renatus, is that correct?
It's
the order.
So it's the order of Raymond Nonatus, which doesn't actually exist, but that's the one they made up.
Well, that makes sense, so you don't get sued by the actual orders. Anyways, it's a convent and a doctor who deal with midwifery and the conveyance and deliverance of babies into this world and all of the complex human relationships that come before and after. It's fantastic. You can find it on a streaming service that has a big red letter for its logo.
The red one and not the green one this week. But so as I said earlier, as we were talking in our promo, I was like, I felt like you have been talking about this for as long as I've known you, which we went to seminary together, which is how we know each other. But why Call the Midwife? Why when we were like, who's out there who wants to come talk on the show? Were you like, I got an episode, or I got a series for you?
Well, pretty much. So the question I mentioned earlier in the intro is one of the questions that drove me to seminary. But the other thing that drove me to seminary was actually watching Call the Midwife. I have always been super passionate about women's health, reproductive health, maternal health. And so I started watching the show and I thought, this is what the church should be like. This is a model for ministry. And so for me, seeing these women in ministry, the nuns and the nurses working together, and with also, we've got different, sometimes the episodes we watched, there's more of the presence of the rector or whatever his actual title is than we often get. That's in there too, but just seeing how that works in the community, and it's so lovely in this community of women. And it really just drove me to think, how could we model this in the church now in the 21st century? Like, how could this look in a new way and taking care of one another like this? And so really, I mean, yeah, between Call the Midwife and then, Mr. Rogers, but other than that, like, that's what sent me to seminary.
Well, and for those of you who haven't seen it, and Barbara is already one of our most stellar guests on 2 on 1 because she cultivated a playlist of episodes that Spiffman could watch, because saying watch 10 series of British programming, while amazing, is not possible, at least with our schedule constraints. We're thankful for the fact. So the 3 episodes we watched were from series 4, 5, and 9. The first one dealt with a midwife, a sister, going to help a sex worker and discovering an outbreak of syphilis, but then realizing God has put on her heart to hand out prophylactics to sex workers and to educate them about safe sex practices, which I still just love. The second episode reminded me of that, because the third one, I was so mad for Monica Jean, it burned away everything else that happened today.
The second one, I actually have notes on that one. So there was the barge dwellers, the family that lived in the barge. And so the nuns and the nurses trying to help them. And then also there was a family where the wife was pregnant and they were only dating for like 3 months. They got married because she was pregnant. And so it was kind of that, like, and they were talking about the contraceptive pill. Like, that was all this, like, what do we do with this new thing, the contraceptive pill? Should we as nuns, should the Church of England say it's okay to give this to our patients? So it was, a lot.
Yes. And of course, in the final episode, the eccentric, history-based, highly intelligent and super awkward, my favorite nun of all time, really wanted to go see The Sound of Music. And I swear I was going to break something when, like, Dr. Turner's son was like, I know who we can give these tickets we won to. And it wasn't Monica Jean. I was so mad and I was so invested, and I'd watched 2 episodes prior. It's a great show. Thank you for recommending it, Barbara.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, she is incredible. And one of you probably noticed by watching from different series that, like, we get some turnover. But right, she's one of the constants. As Sister Monica Joan is there from the beginning. I mean, she's who we meet at the very beginning of the first episode, basically. And yeah, she is fantastic. But yeah, that was disappointing. She did finally get to, a spoiler alert for those who haven't seen it, she does finally get to see Sound of Music, though.
I was going to cancel this interview if she didn't. Like, I was so invested in that because she was so hopeful.
She was so hopeful. And I mean, I lived in Salzburg, so I have a big, like, place in my heart for The Sound of Music too. And I was just like, she's got to go. Like, I'll help her go see it. Like, it was like, but what I really appreciated about the 3 episodes that you gave me, and I watched those 3 because you were like, here are 3. And then I'll just admit, I let like 3 more episodes play as I like wrapped Christmas presents, like from the season 5, I think it was 5. Is that what the last one was? No, 5-9. Anyways, it was great. And I just kept letting it go. And I was like, because as much as we want to say this is a little rote, right? Like the birthing process, the experience of like women having babies, like it seems pretty natural. It holds such a tenderness between, like the humanity of these birthing people and women and the people that bring them into the world and their lives, right? That I think in this season particularly, I've noticed that like you're a first responder, that's who you are, right? And there's not a whole lot like bigger than that. And yet this is like, oh, you're a midwife, or you're a nurse, or you help in this practice, but also who are you writ large? And I think in that first episode you gave us where they talked about, sex work and things like that. It was like, we get titled as religious people and as faith leaders, and that's who we are. And that's who, this sister is. And yet she's so much more and like expands on who we understand them to be. So I guess to ask a question out of all of that is, what does Call the Midwife kind of help us understand about the fullness of humanity, whether it be from faith leaders or sex workers or midwives or any of us, because we're all in the church?
Yeah, for me it's always been well, there's lots of things. I mean, clearly I love it, right? So but I think there's several things, but one thing is this, like you were talking about too, like the stories that don't get told, which are often women's stories. What are we not, who are we not hearing from? And I feel like because these, and in this particular thing, I mean, this is, it starts about 10 years after the Blitz, right? So the first season, which y'all didn't see, was like bombed out buildings. I mean, it's still, we're seeing some of that. And these people that kind of kept the home front going. And then now they are relegated to the sidelines and their stories. And so it's people living in poverty, people who, but because the nurses and the nuns live right in the midst of that, they witness those stories. And so sometimes it's just like that third episode, Sister Julianne was not hearing what the middle-aged woman was saying, and so I think there's a lot of that too in these episodes. I think all three of them kind of were, the church sometimes tries to go in and fix things that we don't understand. And so to me, that's part of the beauty of this, is they live with these people. They live in the middle of them. They know them. Sister Monica Joan delivered these women, and then now they're having their own babies. And so there's this continuity. And I think that's something for those of us like in the Methodist system, we're itinerant. And I think there's great stuff in that. But that's why I love my call as a deacon, is to be in the community and to be outside just the local church and say, well, where is the community hurting? And where is the community thriving? Both of those things. Like, where's God already at work? And so for me, this show shows us that we see God at work among the people sitting in the waiting room to go see the doctor, right? They're helping each other out. They're taking food to each other. The barge women are taking care of one another. Like, God is at work there, whether the church is there or not. And so sometimes our call is just to witness that.
And see, that's a fascinating thing. And I will admit, I've been reading Leonard Sweet's From Tablet to Table this week, and I recommend it highly. It's some evangelical theology that you should take with a grain of salt, certainly, but nothing so egregious as to throw the book across the room. But he does suggest that the church has decided that the table is general, which is fantastic, and it is universal, and it's enormous. And also the table is specific. It's particular to the situation in which it sits. And we've moved away from particular table into, for the sake of welcome, which again is good, but being in the community amongst people, being, I always tell people our name is Riverside Christian Church. We're a church, we're Christians, and also we're in Riverside, which is a neighborhood in Kansas. I'm not in anywhere cool named Riverside. Riverside, Kansas is very cool. Never mind. Okay. We don't even have to edit that. It's a challenge living in Kansas. It's one I like. Anyways, so we know that the church will probably do best in a particular circumstance. We know that the table is most active when it's done in a particular circumstance. How do we turn this ship of church back towards the iceberg of tables? That's not a good metaphor.
Only because I don't think it crashes in that way. But how do we shift us back? Is the question, how do we shift us back into,
how do we regain the particularity?
Community?
Yeah, like this order has done.
I think we let the community tell us who the community is, and not assume, even though we may live within the community, that we understand it completely, right? Because each of us are particular and unique. And so if I heard you correctly, I think that would be my answer, is we have to be willing to help, but willing to listen to what the help actually looks like, and not the help we assume people want or need.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's partly why I picked like that first episode. Well, where Sister Winifred is, I'm sure she would love for there not to be sex workers in Poplar, right? Mm-hmm. But she recognizes that there are. So how can she meet them where they are and say, okay, well, if this is what you're doing, then how can we make it as safe for you as possible, right? How can we as a church love you where you are? And the same thing, like in the other episode with the woman, I have notes here. Let's see if I can find her name. Daisy. But that she said, okay, I wrote down the quote. She said, there's help and there's interference. And that was a thing that really struck me, because when they went and they washed up her kids and they put it, she's like, they don't smell right. My kids don't look like my kids anymore. Like the church, right? It was not the church, but it was the church, had gone beyond thinking they were helping. But instead they were just interfering, something she never asked them to do, and something that they maybe didn't really need. And so I think that to me was a big lesson of, And in the work I'm doing now, we're working with health equity and birth equity, right? But that impacts particularly communities of color. And so for me to say, how am I helping or how am I interfering? So a lot of that for me is just listening and, bearing witness and then trying to elevate, those voices, not speak over them. And so I think that's a big thing to learn, and that they're constantly having to be reminded of in this show, partly because we get new nurses and we get new people, but we all need that reminder.
I liked the turnover of the nurses, and you'd given us a heads up. You're like, okay, well, in this one, there's just like some new people there, but like, that's the church, right? There's always kind of there's new clergy, there's new congregants, there's new families, there's new buildings, whatever. Like that turnover is always there. And so like that reminder that like, when you come into a new space, or when someone comes into a new space, that like, to listen and not to assume that what the community needs and everything, was just like, I was very much reminded of church in that kind of cycle of who they are and what they're doing. And I was reminded of how church should be, particularly, I will say that first episode was my favorite, when she goes in and she's not like trying to like convert or saying like, well, I should see you in church, what's your relationship with God? She was just like, here are condoms, here are things, like
Beads.
yeah, exactly. And so it was just very much like a really beautiful way. And like, if we stop worrying so much, the kind of Protestant mainline American church, stop worrying so much about like who's coming to Jesus, and be more curious about how, God, Jesus, whoever you name as, part of your understanding of the divine is at work in your life.
Go be Jesus. Stop trying to talk about him. Just go be him.
Or be Jesus. Right. Yeah. Like how do, I was really appreciative of like, oh, she's a nun just walking through a brothel, and like no judgment. I mean, there's judgment because we all carry judgment, but not in a way that they did not feel less than or unworthy.
She's not going to bless the work, but she's also not going to turn her away.
I think she does bless the work. I think I might push back on that. I think that there's a blessing there of when we value someone else. I think that like in their fullness, I think that can act as a blessing. I don't know, Barbara, what do you think?
Well, I'm thinking, and I'm trying to remember, there's so many episodes where they deal, because this is a huge part of this community, right? And so there's lots of episodes that come back to the sex workers and the different, and also the stories that we get about the unwed mothers. And so that comes up with the contraceptive pill and that issue. This season 10, that just finished like this yesterday, they had this big recap of 10 years of Call the Midwife. They had a look back. But it, like so this past season has been talking about abortion. Well, and a couple other seasons, I think season 9, season 8, but so that it was at that point in history, because they take a very historical approach. They really look at what was in the news during the time that this was happening. And so there's they're talking about abortion, or when they're talking about the pill, there's this often the doctor, like Dr. Turner, who I love. Dr. Turner was kind of butting heads with Sister Julianne, who's kind of in charge of this order. She's not over the whole order, but this particular branch of it. And, where does the church stand on this? And he says, well, the church has this morality, right? We have to be the voice of morals. And they're like, but women are dying, or babies are being born out of wedlock, which then sends them in this time period, right? That's basically a big stamp on them, on the parent, on the child. And so how do we prevent that, right? So if we can give unwed mothers or women contraceptive pills so that they don't become unwed mothers, right? Because they can only prescribe it, and this is a story that comes up, it can only be prescribed to people who are married, right? Because this is the law. And then like with the abortions, there's a whole huge storyline about that, which it's still every season. I think, how did they pick the storylines that actually end up being pertinent to what is going on in our country? And it's not us, right? They're in the UK and they air these like 6 months before we get them. But because the sad thing is, right, these stories repeat. So what was pertinent in the 50s and 60s is still pertinent, which says so much about the progress we've made in reproductive justice, or the lack of progress we've made in reproductive justice. And so I don't remember what the beginning of that was. I just have gone off on a tangent.
Well,
Sorry, but
it's a very fertile tangent, because I will say, watching this as a man, and I guess as a gay man, but definitely as a man, it fascinates me. This sounds so stupid, and I recognize it in advance, and I'm giving it fascinates me that women have their own language that they speak when they are alone, which is duh. Of course women do. I think the show conveys there's a servant leadership to the religious order that can only be done by the female characters. That doesn't indicate only women should serve, obviously. I think there's a time and placeness that speaks to the particular role, which is always pushing boundaries and making more room. That is not to shut folks out, but instead to bring them in. And I don't think that's the part that sounds stupid. The thing that sounds stupid is women are different when they're not with men. So there you go.
No, I think the struggle to be a woman in our fullness has yet to be resolved in any era, which is why it becomes pertinent in every era. And we just have understood it and the nuances, I think, a little bit better more recently, that like, yes, women have our own language when we're together and around each other, but also then Black women have their own spaces, and queer Latina women also have their own, like, and that it's nuanced in the same way that I've have not experienced, because I'm not, but like gay men have their own language as well. Like there's club language that absolutely happens, and I'm not saying that's just a particular part of a culture and identity, and like so it's all kind of pieced together that like when you feel safe, you get to shorthand and you get to like name some things. And it's the same way, I think, we have biblical spaces that, when Christians get together, we have our same passages. How often are we checking probably Barbara a lot, because you're starting new ministries, but like those of us that are in congregational ministries and resources, how often do you go back and make sure that the pamphlet that you have that says who you are doesn't have insider language that was created 20 years ago?
Yeah. And that's something that I don't think, from what I remember, I don't think any of the 3 episodes I sent y'all really touched on this much. But one of the things that a lot of the episodes do talk about is the immigrant experience. That third one, we did have the nurse who is from Jamaica. And so there's a whole storyline when she comes and how she is treated, like even as the nurse midwife, right? There are women who say, I want a white midwife to deliver my baby. There's a storyline about that, at least one, multiple, I think. But then how she fits in her church, they have a home church that's kind of a tangent. But then, and I think it was the most recent episode, the finale, or maybe one before that, this season too, they were talking about women from India and Pakistan and they were setting up a new like clinic, a class for them to come, because their traditions around birthing and their traditions around motherhood were so different. And the nurses and the midwives it was taking them a little time to kind of pick up on that. And once they did, they said, how about we invite them to a class that we translate into Punjabi? They were trying to find translators for other languages too, but they hadn't gotten there yet. But saying, because they had this tradition of not seeing anyone but family right after the baby was born. So having a baby at the hospital where the doctor might be there or other people in the room was taboo, kind of. They didn't ever use that word, but right. But somebody had to explain that to them, but they listened. And it was great because one of the nuns went and was like, she's young, she's fiery, I love her. And she was like, we're going to make this happen. How do we reach these mothers? And it was reaching them on their own terms and then getting them. And so I think that's it. Like we were talking about, like there's these spaces. And so even though they're all women, right, they're women from a certain background. And so like you said, like different women have these different things. And so how do we as the church that want to be part of helping that progress, or helping them, how can we listen faithfully and not get to interfere? How do we help instead of interfere, right? That same thing, like that other question, which I think is something that's so important, because we can't be butting our noses and everything and just taking over. We've tried that for a long time and it's clearly not working super well.
No.
Well, and what does it mean that, I'm sorry, Spiff.
No, go ahead.
What does it mean too that, announcing midwife, people always open the door. Like they're always let through, they're always pushed into, like it's always there. The church has lost that, and the church has lost that because it has not earned it, or does not continue to earn it, and I stand by that. How do we get that back? And I think part of it is invitation, but how else? What else can we do?
What I think, they had already lost it by that point, but as we were talking about, because they were women, and because they were women working with other women and dealing with the most intimate parts of women's lives, I think they earned that respect. That like Father Tom wouldn't have, he was in a couple of the episodes. I don't think he had that same response if he went knocking on people's doors. So I think it is this interesting, I think it's because they put in the time too. They were there, they're delivering babies, they're getting dirty, they're sleeping on people's floors while the women are in labor. They're, out in it, except sometimes not, like we saw where Sister Julianne was like, oh, if I go out without my habit on, people do treat me differently. So yeah, but I think it was happening then, but they had and so I think it comes back to that, like the group of women, and also being with people in those intimate moments. But how do we earn the invitation? I mean, how do we even get to that point now?
Yeah, I think I was having a conversation with a friend the other day. It's around our anti-racism work, and it's like, well, we're gonna mess up, we're gonna do things, but like part of it is like showing up consistently. That helps you build relationships and trust, so that when you do mess up, or when you are needed, you're invited in. And I think that is shown here well, because yes, they are, there's an attachment to religion writ large with all of these, women and midwives and kind of everyone, but it comes almost secondary to making sure that like the human connection is there, which I really appreciate. That it's like, these are, and yes, it's a woman to woman thing, but it's more than that. It's the fact that like, I feel like if there, and maybe there are in later seasons, but like a male midwife comes in, you know what I mean? Like, or whatever, that it would be that same thing, right? That it is connection to connection, rather than the church to a birthing mother, which is, kind of what also you could cast that narrative as saying, well, this show is about a church helping, birthing people, but it's not, it's about human connection, which kind of was really helpful as we come up on Advent 1 this Sunday. And, so we're starting to prepare for the coming of Christ, if you are a Christian, and in these spaces. And I think we gloss over the humanity of it so often. We romanticize the beauty of, look at this holy family. We know what's coming in, anticipating, but like so much that this show holds tenderly and beautifully is that it's the unexpected. We get to know that like a healthy baby Christ child is coming, but like in this space, these mothers don't necessarily know if their babies are healthy. I mean, mothers writ large even now don't know, and all of that. And so for y'all, where did you see a message of maybe preparation or like Advent, hope, maybe, because we're going into, isn't hope Advent 1? Where do you see the call to live into 2-on-1's infamous love of Advent within the show?
I think that the only thing that's wrote is the process by which babies are delivered. That is, they're able to say, you need to walk. There was birth that was done on knees or with breathing, or there's all of these tactics to be done, but each case obviously has to be different. And it's not the same baby that's born every time. And I literally thought of that earlier, but it can't be. It's always a different baby. And one of those babies had they called it a birthmark.
Oh yeah, the strawberry mark. Yeah.
Like, what if we said every year when we celebrate Jesus' Advent and coming into this world, it's a different baby. Like it's a brand new, completely unpredictable thing, except we know like we're going for 10 fingers, 10 toes. And
I'd even say that's ableist. Let's get new babies. every
You know
year.
what? That's fair. As I said that's absolutely ableist, but let's just hope it's a person.
We'll go with person. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, it's a person. It's a little tiny fragile person. Thank you, Spiff. Man, ableism is just everywhere. Excuse me, friend.
Crazy.
Yeah, I think that's great, thinking about how it is different. It is the same, but it is different. I mean, I have 3 children. All 3 of their childbirths were different, even though they were all delivered by C-section. I won't give y'all all the details, but I mean, even that, right? Each of those was different, and the pregnancy was different. And of course, my children are different; they're not clones of each other, but it is, and there's something to, and I love the thinking about the humanity of it, because, and the fragility of it, because we, like you said, we know how the outcome. We know that Jesus was born, and we know that Mary seemed to not, die in childbirth, right? She didn't. And we don't know what happened to Joseph, but whatever. We we have that we know it turned out okay, and Elizabeth, but there's other stories, in scripture where we don't have that perfect outcome. I mean, Rachel dies in childbirth. We have these stories, and we know that fragility, and the fragility of life of that baby. And so I think there's something about the humanity, and I love how they do in this show. They show us it's graphic. I probably should have warned you all about that. I forgot to warn you about that part, because I'm used to it. My kids walk in the room when I'm watching and they're like, oh, because it's loud and it's messy. But I mean, so is life, right? Like, it's not just childbirth. All of life is loud and messy and scary and beautiful. So I love how that's captured. And I think that is something we sanitize. We sanitize Advent. We sanitize the Christmas story. I love thinking about Mary. Joseph was not sitting there and like a little pristine white, glowing, for so many reasons, not a white glowing baby Jesus, like, came out, right? Like, Joseph was probably pacing in the streets, and there were probably midwives in there with Mary, and it was messy and it was dirty, and Jesus came out covered in goop, and nobody wants to talk about that. So it was.
And they put him in a feeding trough.
Right.
And I'm sorry, I just,
which is a beautiful metaphor for the coming table. No, I'm just kidding.
no, honestly,
yeah, that's a whole other, but yeah, no, I mean, like, that's exactly what I thought of too, right? Is that, like, and this has come up because we talk about Advent a lot on the show, but it's like, we are rarely saying, let's celebrate this teenage child who, shows up at your door, pregnant with their very much older partner, and that you're like, what is happening here? And yet, we romanticize it, and we cleanse it or sanitize it in a way that's just like, I think, to the detriment of who we are as people, because if we were to hold that in its fullness, I think it would be less commercialized. I think we would be able to hold on to the truth that comes with this newness of life and all that comes with it. And so for me, I was like, oh, this is I'm so glad we chose this, because, again, deuces who are listening and seeing it now, we've been talking with Barbara about this for a while. Like, we booked this a couple months ago, and we're like, let's do this for Advent, because it seems like the right time to, like, let's start talking. So maybe this is the invitation, everyone, or the message y'all needed to say, this season I'm going to actually talk a little bit about the messiness of this journey.
And there has to be a subversiveness, right? Like, part of me wants to say, of course we need the subversiveness of women, of the queer community, of non-white communities of color, or non-white presenting. And part of me is like, I'm tired of subversion, right? I just want to have a seat at the table that I don't have to, like, sneak up on and, like, sidle into, or, wait tables till there's a chair open or whatever. But it's so Puah and Shifra, my 2 favorite characters from Exodus 1, because it's that or Pharaoh. There's always been this tradition of, when new life comes in, that is what must be protected, and that is what must be upheld, right? Pharaoh's like, kill all the Hebrew boys. Oh, those Hebrew women, they just pop them out and they go hide, and we can't catch them. Oh no, what do we do? And they're also still delivering children. I really liked this, and I don't think I have a question. There's the Arthur, I don't know what I'm saying moment in this interview. Barbara, we've been talking a lot.
Well, I was thinking about too, like while we were talking about this, I have to throw out this quote because it's my favorite, and I had to pull it up on my phone because I have to get it right. And I carry this, it's in my notes when I look at it all the time. And it's from Sister Monica Joan. And she said, obstetricians will never be satisfied until women are entirely absent from the sacrament of birth. And that was from an early season. And I wrote that down years ago, and I just keep it in my notes app. And I've thought about that because I think about that as my job as a deacon. I'm not called to sacrament. In the United Methodist Church, elders are called to sacrament. But there are, I mean, like the fact that, you know, Sister Monica Jones is the sacrament of birth, like it's so sacred. But then also we as a society, not just as a church, yes, it's a church, but we want to sanitize it. You know, I mean, I had my babies in the hospital and there's nothing wrong with that. But also sometimes it can become, like we were talking about, it's rote, it becomes this thing. And so, and I think the time that here, right, men were not in the room when the babies were being born. The fathers, like there's some episodes where fathers want to be present while their child's born and they're like, no, or finally they're starting to let them now in the 60s. And so it is this like the sacrament of, and it is, and I think about that right in Advent, and we talk about like, right, we've got John the Baptist, right? Think about Elizabeth and you know, she was like 40 or something. And I love this image of like a 40-year-old woman and like a 13-year-old, her 13-year-old cousin, like walking into a church, both like 8 months pregnant. How would we as a church respond to that now? Like, to me, that's the image. I know they didn't, well, I mean, maybe they went somewhere together. I don't know, but, or 8 months and 6 months, whatever. But like, think about that. Like, how did their communities respond to them and how would we respond to them? And just the holiness of that and the beauty that's in it, but also there's fear and there's terror. And so I just think that's part of it for the church. How do we look at this? This is a sacrament, and beyond birth, but just so much of this, you know, women's bodies that are not treated as holy. And so how do we get back to that? And especially in Advent, like if it were not for a woman's body, we would not have a Christ child.
The sacrament of birth makes, yeah, that's the line, by the way, for.
Yeah, I was like, oh my goodness, what I lit in my head. I was like, how do we get new sacraments? Because, you know, we've got two. So we've got baptism.
Yeah, we've got two also. Yep, we're with you.
We have zero. We have ordinances.
Oh, that's true.
Oh, well, yeah, we actually have sacraments, but yeah, there's two of them.
Bill Williams, don't send us an email about that. I
was trying to be relatable to the wider audience because we're not just a disciple, but like, yes, you are correct. We have ordinances. But I'm like, well, what would it take for us to the church writ large? I mean, and that goes back, I think, to your actual work of like your sacred worth, right? What happens when we actually value women's bodies and women in their fullness as divine images of God? What happens when that new, you know, if we change the baby every year that comes, what happens when that is a female baby, you know, a signed female at birth baby, a you know, all the different babies of the world. And I think it starts there, at least in part, right? Is that like, when we see that with the dad who wanted a son because of lots of different things, like women have been undervalued since before we were actual formed humans. From the thought of us, we are undervalued in thought before we are in breath. And
that was a continued thread through the episodes was, I want a boy, I want a son, I want a boy.
You would think I intentionally picked them for that, but no, that's just society.
No, there were a few times where I was like, is this why she picked them?
No, I actually had forgotten about those subplots. I really picked them because I wanted the story of with Sister Winifred and the sex workers, and then the story with the barge woman. I remembered that one. And then, but then I was like, oh, look, there's a thread here about how women's lives are not valued. Yeah.
Unfortunately is prevalent in just about all fiction that has any basis in history or the present day, which is frustrating and annoying. And I'm sorry.
Right. And like, I love that quote. I had written that down too from Nurse Crane, where she was like, they wanted us during the war. I'm paraphrasing here, but like once that's over, they're like, oh, she said, get back in your box and don't say boo, which sounded like my grandmother. That sounded like something my grandmother would say. But like my grandmother worked in a flight suit factory during the war. Right. But then after the war, she was a homemaker, which was great. But, it's that when we need you, come on. But now, oh, no, never mind. Let the men folk here.
It's when we have no other choice but to accept you as equal.
Yeah.
It's why the churches, generally you see churches finally accept a call to ministry from women after a male predecessor has kind of destroyed, right? We come in for cleanup. We come in like, well, we have nothing else to lose. Let's give it to the women. And we're slowly making progress, but like, that's a big part of where we've seen historically women come in is like, no, like, oh, this is destroyed. We kind of clean up and rebuild.
And women can then work twice as hard against twice as much adversity. But if they do as well as their male predecessor, then they're not doing well enough. Like
I mean, it's always picked and pushed apart. Like there is not a single non-male person here listening to this show that hasn't had that experience of just being like, we work all of those spaces. And if you are a woman of color, an unhoused woman, an immigrant woman, like it's exponentially worse depending on, where you're at. But like in America, exponentially worse. But I wanted to, before we kind of move into our like, the latter half of it, or latter bit of this, I was really, one of the lines, and we kind of touched on it a minute ago, was that there's that dad who was like, no, I plan on being there. And all the other dads or partners, like, were like, you want to be on the business end of that, and he was just like, I do. And I just took a moment and really thought about the courage and the vulnerability it took for him to say that to his peers, and how I wished the men in my life who are so beautifully, wonderfully faithful to their own self progress and worth, those that are, tapped into their vulnerability and all of that, could continue those courageous actions. And it's like they do, and they do it in their own time. But like, I was just really moved by that and what it took for him to start changing the narrative just enough, because now all of those people in that room can never say they've never heard of a man wanting to be in a birthing center or, witnessing the birth. And whether or not they do or don't, it's like, it plants a seed in your mind. And it made me think of, who are we not listening to, who continues to say their truth in our churches and in our spaces, that if we heard them, we would hear for the first time a counter narrative to what we know.
Yeah. And if I remember correctly too, I think it was Nurse Crane that was attending with that birth, and she was annoyed by him.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting too, like, and so I think that goes along with that, right? Like, who are we, like you said, as the church, that we're like, I mean, it reminds me of like when my kids were little and they're like, I want to help you cook. Okay, well, it's going to take 5 times as long if you help me. But also, right, that's how they learn. And so I think who are we as a church pushing away and saying, oh, if I try to bring you alongside me, this is just let me do it. So how often are we, I think it goes along with that too. Like I love that thought of who's trying to be there, who's trying to be in the room. And we think we're doing them a favor by saying, no, just let me take care of it. But it's that gracious, I can't think of the word, but it's kind of that same thing, like the help versus interference, but it's the opposite of that, like not allowing it, but we're not doing it necessarily from a place of, I can't even othering. It's just, oh, this isn't how we've done it. I think maybe it goes along with that. This is not the way we do it here. And if I have to redo the way I'm doing it, that's just going to be more work for me. When really it could be something beautiful and lovely.
Yeah. I mean, we had someone come up, and this is, it just happens, right? You learn, you do better. But like, so we have communion every Sunday. We used to have, these beautiful loaves of bread. People would, a particular woman would come up and say, oh, I'm gluten-free. And we would hand her a like side wafer, right? Because it was our gluten-free option. But then like one day, like she and I were having a conversation. She was just like, I love this church. I feel so left out at communion. And we are like, that's our big thing, right? Everyone is welcome, blah, blah, blah.
One of our ordinances, yes.
Yeah, it is one of our ordinances. And so, and she was like, because it's not the same. Like we see one bread, one body before and at, or after, and yet you hand me this like side wafer for whatever reason. And I was just like, oh my gosh, you've been saying I am gluten-free to every single, service for however many months I've been here at that point. And I was like, so we scoured everywhere and we found a loaf of challah bread that we wanted that was also gluten-free. And like, so now we all eat that. But it was just like, she had been speaking her truth and saying what she needed. And for whatever reason, in the time in which I could finally hear it, but I think it was that I had made the relationship. I went and had the one-on-one. It wasn't just serving and serving. And that is what that's what they do well in this show, is they listen in spaces that hold the actual truth of who these women are, and not just placing them as kind of a cog in the larger narrative of like the birthing process.
Yeah. And I think so much of that too is because they do the home visits.
Yeah.
And, I'm super Methodist. So, I'm going to say, right, that's one thing, John Wesley, I mean, that's in my ordination vows. It says, will you visit from house to house? And I have to say yes to that in my ordination vows. That is part of, and I mean, I'm not doing it right now. Also COVID, right? But it is to me like the meeting people where they are, but also then you really see them, because it's easy for me to put on a smile, put on a nice dress, do my hair, kind of do my hair, and go out in public. Right. But somebody coming to my home and going, oh, you have no running water. I mean, I do. but like, and so I think they go, oh, this is actually, that's when, like, for a lot of these people, they go, oh, this is how these people live. Like there was an episode recently where there was a rat and they called the slumlord. Basically, they're like, look, your people babies and rats are sleeping together in these homes. Like, this is not okay. But he hadn't ever been to visit. He just lived in his, in his fancy house in the country. And he finally came out and was like, oh, this is what I own. Like, he didn't even know. So I think that's where we as a church too. And that how do we make that, and it may not necessarily be their home, but it's that's how you build those connections.
So absolutely. And I think that is, as we start to come back from whatever the last couple of years were, and they were, what they were was a kind of a really hard and a really tragic way of needing to reset the world, reset our relationships, reset how we understand what was happening in the church and all of that. But I think when we come out of that, and as we think of like what is next, this show really beautifully, and in this season of Advent of, as we are preparing for all the what nexts that are to come, it reminds us that the relational is the actual church. It's not the building. It's not the titles. It's not even, the ordinances and sacraments. It is the connection of God between each of us and the valuing of that in equitable and just spaces, as we move into every what's next of each other in the church.
All right. Well, we are.
I was like, that's really fun.
And I realize it's my job to be cognizant of time. That's one of the phrases I use every week. We do thank you so much, Barbara, for being our guest today and for the good work you are doing with, your life and your ministry. And thank you. And by the way, I don't have to report you to the district superintendent where you are, because you did mention John Wesley in an
good. Thank you. Check.
And
enough time. So I need to throw in like some Charles. So I need to sing a hymn, or are we good?
We haven't said quadrilateral yet. And we're a little perturbed. But as our first Methodist on episode number 75 of 2 on 1, we're really glad you're here with us today. That's right. 75 episodes, we'll have a Methodist.
All right.
I'm just being stupid, of course. Instead of being stupid, I'm going to invite Spiff to ask our final question that we ask all of our guests, Wesleyan or not.
We love our Methodists. Listen, I'm at Drew, so I've got all my Methodist people now. Yes, thank you so much for coming. This has been wonderful. Thank you for kind of finally getting me to watch this show that has been in my mind for so long. Before we ask our final question, though, I want to just how can people find you and support your ministries and all the really good work that you are doing?
Sacred Worth, which is spelled like it sounds, .org is my website, and that should have links to all of, in theory, it's live now, and it should have links to all my social media. But I am like under Sacred_Worth on Instagram too. So that's probably a good way to find me too.
Perfect. Good. We just wanted to make sure that we give a plug, because the work that you were doing is, is so wonderful, so needed in this world. And I really appreciate and we really appreciate and value it. And especially as we're coming up on, again, Christmas, right? Like these are the questions that we need to continuously have around how do we, the story, is it a story about Jesus? Is it a story about Mary? And all the questions in between. But as is our final question, what biblical story, theme, narrative, character are you most reminded of in Call the Midwife?
There are so many, and so I don't want to take all of them. So I'm going to say, I think, okay, I have to mention two, though. I think one, first of all, is, I mean, all the women, but I think Hannah in particular, because when we have Hannah, who has not had a baby, and she is praying in the temple, and the priest comes up to her and says, what is wrong? Are you drunk? What's happening? And she's like, no, I'm praying for a baby. And like the fact that he didn't recognize that is a need that she had, like, to me, that's where we are as a church still. We're like, what are these women? What's going on with these women? Like just all of that. And then I think also in Exodus, to me, the story at Exodus 2, where we see Moses' sister and mother, when they put him in the basket and they put him in the river, and Pharaoh's daughter comes with her handmaidens. And I love reading that story to people. And I say, who's this story about? And they always say it's about Moses. And I say, no, this story is about those women. Mm-hmm. We don't even know that it's Moses until the end of the story. But we have been so trained to look for the men that nobody notices these 5 or more women in this story. And if it weren't for them, we wouldn't have Moses. And so I think and the fact that it's a mother giving up her baby, but then becoming a nursemaid, like there's so much in there is so rich, and we just ignore all of it because, oh, look, cute Moses in a basket. So who are we ignoring to look at Moses right now, I think?
Oof. My favorite midrash about it is that they, first of all, not the midrash, the verb form of planted herself in the river is stationed. Like, it's like she's in the mud, she's there, she's watching. My favorite midrash is that it was a calm day on the Nile, so she just kind of shoved the basket and it drifted like 2 feet. And Pharaoh's mother was like, gee, where did this baby come from? And this huge feminine conspiracy.
I definitely think there's some conspiracy going, which I think fits Call the Midwife perfectly too.
Absolutely. I'm going to go for Lydia as my answer, because there's a level of resource, and I think it was alluded to, there's 1,000 ways we can get this child to be born, and every case is different. We're going to make things work, and maybe I'm just too steeped in Philippi right now, but I'm really digging Lydia's house, and I'm really digging this, so that's what I'm going for. Not my best answer, but a good one.
I like it. Listen, I don't think anyone said Lydia in any of our answers yet. I'm going for Mary, but here's why. It's not necessarily that we were coming up on her birth, but I see Mary as a kind of reflection of all of these midwives, in which they hold the fullness of humanity, like her 16-year-oldness, her curiosity around her own pregnancy, let's say, or maybe her knowledge of how she became pregnant, and all the rumors that fly and all of this. And yet she ushers in the Christ child, and these midwives usher in every new Christ child since, and hold that fullness of humanity in each of both the birth, the birth, the death, and everything in between that happens in those space. And Mary, in my understanding, and in kind of all that happens to her, she has this, she has a said child, but that historically that probably wouldn't have ended there. Right now that she has that knowledge of birth, she can share that knowledge. She can help other pregnant women and people like figure out their own spaces as well. And so like this kind of rite of passage and this ushering in of creation and birth, for me, kind of she is one of the midwives, not just necessarily one of the mothers.
Lovely.
So that's where we're at for Hope on Advent 1, friends.
That's where we're at. Of course, we want to thank Barbara for being on our show today. Thank you again and again. Sacredworth.org is where you can find out more about all the good work that Barbara is doing. for the sake of and in the world. And that's going to be it. Once again, our show is sponsored by JeffOnerow.com. Did you know, by the way, Barbara, that Jeff Onrow does pastor stoles, which hang equally on the shoulders, and diaconal stoles that are diagonal? You can find all of those at JeffOnerow.com. On behalf of 2 on 1, I'm the Reverend Arthur Stewart.
I'm the Reverend Stephanie Kendall.
And we'll see you next time, Deuces. Bye.
Get more 2 on 1 at 2on1project.com.